If your questioning about alcohol shows you it's actually really hard for me not to drink in certain situations, being sober curious actually can be a valid way to quit drinking completely. I used to be wary of saying that because the messaging that the only way to quit completely is to do a 12-step program and to be in Alcoholics Anonymous. But actually I think that being sober curious is valid for people who want to completely remove alcohol from their lives.
Absolutely. Welcome to the Stay Curious Show. I'm your host, JW Wiseman, founder of Curious Elixirs, the world's best booze-free beverages. This is the show where we explore the business and culture of the Sober Curious movement, and our guest today might be the single most influential person of that movement. Hi, Ruby. Welcome.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Come on in, have a seat. So excited to have you on the show.
Same. Yeah, it's going to be a good conversation.
Yeah, and so, always good to have a drink to celebrate with. This is our rosé, Curious number 9. And let me pour you some so that we can have something to start off the conversation. Cheers to you.
Well, cheers.
Salud.
Salud.
So I want to introduce my guest, Ruby Warrington. She is a prolific author, creator of the term Sober Curious. That came from her book from 2018, Sober Curious, and later the books, The Sober Curious Reset, along with many other books. She's also been a journalist and started her own, would you call The Numinous a magazine? How would you refer to The Numinous?
The Numinous no longer exists in its original form, but it was an online magazine that was sort of dedicated to all things mystical, but through a very modern lifestyle lens. And that was really honestly my entry point into this whole world. That's where the story really begins. So we could begin there, or we can begin at any point you want, but The Numinous was an online magazine.
Amazing. Okay, cool. So, because I'm familiar with your work with Material World, Mystical Girl. Am I saying that?
Material Girl, Mystical World.
Mystical World. Material Girl, Mystical World. Did the Numinous grow out of that research, or how did this first become?
The Numinous came first.
The Numinous came first.
So I found myself in my mid-30s kind of grappling with probably like an early onset midlife crisis. Just having achieved so many of my goals and ambitions for myself and feeling deeply unfulfilled. I mean, I graduated with a first-class honors degree in journalism, and immediately, the first piece I wrote was published in the Face magazine, which Gen Xers like us will be familiar with how cool that was, And quite quickly over the next 10 years, I worked my way up to editing a magazine in Ibiza. I spent a year in Ibiza editing Pasha magazine, which was like VIP access to every club and every event on the island.
Wow.
I came back to London and has scored a features editor job at the Sunday Times Style magazine, which was kind of like the equivalent of working for New York Times Styles in New York. It was like literally your name on every single guest list. Everybody wants to be your friend. And I was drinking quite heavily, but not in what felt like a problematic way. I was drinking the way that we all drank in that sort of industry and that community, It was, we were enthusiastic social drinkers, let's say. But I began this deep sort of period of questioning of what is this all about? What do I really want? Who really am I underneath all of the achievements and the accolades? I hadn't really given myself life goals beyond like have a fabulous career. And I had a fabulous career, and I was so stressed. I had so much anxiety, wasn't sleeping well. I was starting to feel really angry, and I couldn't really figure out what I was angry about.
Wow.
But something definitely wasn't right. And one of the questions that came up during that process of questioning was around how I was using alcohol. But it would take me several more years to really kind of begin to grapple with that. First, I needed to ask those questions, those really deep questions like, who am I? What do I really want? And astrology was a tool that I found at that period in my life that really started to help me begin to dive into those deeper kind of existential questions. Like, what is my purpose? What are my gifts? What do I want to achieve with my life, Astrology is an incredible tool for self-awareness. I don't really use astrology as a tool for prediction, which is how it's kind of sort of used in the mainstream a lot of the time.
It's kind of a misconception, is it not?
It can be used for prediction, but I find it to be more useful as a tool for self-awareness and self-understanding. Once you learn to read your own astrological birth chart, there are just kind of like limitless prompts within a chart to unpack and uncover who am I, What am I here to offer? What do I need to feel safe, secure, fulfilled, etc., etc.?
What did you find when you were examining your birth chart?
Looking back now, the most important thing I have uncovered, I think, is what a deeply sensitive person I am. I am an Aries, and Aries are very confident and go-getting and quite competitive and ambitious. And I certainly embodied a lot of those traits in my career. But my deep, deep sensitivity, which is uncovered, or I can see in my Cancer moon and various other placements in my chart, meant that I was having to almost kind of shield myself to be able to be out and live that quite ambitious, kind of fast-paced life. And alcohol was one of the major things I used to shield myself, shield my sensitive nature. But I also think that, well, I know that my deep, deep sensitivity is one of the things that makes me a good writer. It's one of the things that means I've been able to tap into these kind of emerging cultural movements and sort of bring them into the mainstream. I'm very sensitive to what's happening in my environment, my immediate environment, but also socially and culturally. And so while I was content kind of pursuing a career where the kind of journalism I'm doing was a lot of like trend reporting, social trends, it was very surface. This deeper kind of like, there are a lot of sort of shadow work placements in my chart too. I have a real need and a desire to kind of get underneath the hood, talk about taboos, lift up, talk about the things that nobody's talking about. And I think that's very much reflected in my work going forward. The subjects that I have written on are those things like, why is nobody talking about this?
And you made such a great, perfectly edgy term for this movement that nobody knew was happening. You gave a name to it, to something, you know, and I'm fascinated by, how did you come to recognize this in your own life? Was it through asking yourself these questions and then starting to drink less that you started to uncover that, oh wow, there's pockets of people like me all over the place? Like, how did that happen?
In terms of sober curious?
Yes.
Yeah. So around this same time, this kind of existential crisis that I was experiencing, like I said, alcohol, sort of starting to question how I was using alcohol, the true impact of the way that I was using alcohol on my well-being, primarily my kind of mental and emotional well-being, really started to bubble up to the fore. And the more awareness I cultivated around sort of what I actually needed and what I actually wanted from my life, it began to become clearer and clearer that alcohol was preventing me actually from achieving or reaching a lot of the parts that I wanted to go with my life. And so I started this period of deep questioning around my drinking. Why do I drink the way I do? Why am I expected to drink the way that I do? Why is it sometimes so hard not to drink? Am I drinking too much? What is too much? All these kind of questions were very kind of present for me. And this is going back to sort of 2011, 2012. I moved to US in 2012. And at the time, asking those questions, a lot of the time what I would be led to was, if you're asking these questions, you're an alcoholic, you need to be in addiction, you need to be in recovery for alcohol addiction. And so after a year or so of questioning, I did go to a couple of AA meetings. I have some friends, you know, I'm sure most of us have some friends who are in recovery, right? And so, because it's actually not uncommon at all. So I did go to a few AA meetings, but what I heard wasn't a reflection of my experiences. I hadn't had the sort of dramatic rock bottom with my drinking that the majority of people in those rooms were speaking about. And it didn't feel right for me to use the word alcoholic. I didn't feel like I had a disease. There isn't a history of it in my family necessarily. It just didn't fit. But still, I knew that the way that I was using alcohol, by that point, I had sort of come to an awareness that it wasn't really serving me and that I definitely wanted to make a change. So I just began taking longer and longer breaks from drinking. I began forcing myself to go into situations sober where I would usually use alcohol and just sort of see what happened, see how I felt.
Throw away the guardrails.
Throw away the guardrails and just kind of allow myself to experiment or get curious about what a life without alcohol might look like for me.
I'm very familiar with going into those situations and being like, oh, this is awkward or this is uncomfortable, but I've got to do it.
What I decided to do in those situations was to treat everything that came up as just more information that I could then start to apply to my drinking choices going forwards. I didn't really have the intention of quitting drinking altogether. That was actually unthinkable to me, given the extent to which alcohol was just interwoven with my life. It was right there at the center of my social life, my relationship with my husband, my family relationships, relationships with colleagues. Alcohol was just ever present, as it was for everybody I knew, right? It was very normal to drink excessively, enthusiastically, and just to kind of deal with the consequences. But like I said, I had really started to question this. And the more I began to pull out of what I've come to term like the dominant drinking culture, the more clarity I began to get around the way I was using alcohol, the reasons I was using alcohol, how it actually made me feel. And it went on for about 2-3 years of just this kind of experimentation, embarking on a lot of what I've come to call sober firsts. Those experiences with just kind of like first sober vacation, first sober date night, like first sober family holiday, you know? Very uncomfortable experiences, most of them, and full of so much great information about what my triggers were for picking up a drink and what I was drinking to cover up a lot of the time. I hadn't realized until I started to remove alcohol how much I was using alcohol as a medicine or as a band-aid for uncomfortable feelings I didn't want to feel. I had always thought I just drink to have more fun. And in fact, a lot of my friends, when I told them I was thinking about removing alcohol or stepping back, reflected that to me, that you don't have a problem. You just drink to have more fun, because that was how it looked on the outside. But inside, it was far more complicated than that. And it was after a few years of this kind of experimentation that I did start to realize that a lot of the people in my life who looked on the outside like what I would call normal social drinkers had a lot of the same questions as me. And so I decided to host a gathering in my home. I just put it out to a bunch of people I thought might be interested. Anybody want to have a conversation about this? And about 7 or 8 people showed up, and we had such a fascinating conversation. It was the first time I felt like I could really talk completely openly with other people who are having similar experiences to me. The same way someone who's, reached that rock bottom might feel that same sense of relief going to an AA meeting and feeling like, here are some people who get it, right? And the success of that kind of private event made me think about, well, how about doing a public-facing event? I was working on the Numinous by this point. I had been hosting various events in New York City and had got quite into that sort of scene, I suppose.
Are you referring to Club Soda, or is this building up to Club Soda?
No, this would be the first Club Soda. I was now starting to concept. So Club Soda was an event series that ran from April 2016 to October 2018 that I co-hosted with a meditation teacher called Biet Simkin, who does have 12-step recovery experience. I was very nervous still about having a conversation out loud about what if you want to quit drinking but you don't identify as an alcoholic? Or what if you're having some problems with alcohol, you've got questions about alcohol, but it's not a rock bottom? I was very nervous about introducing this into the discourse, because so much of the messaging around alcohol addiction is that, for anyone who is addicted to alcohol, even keeping the door open a half inch can be a matter of life and death, right? This is really serious business. So I wanted to team up with Biet because I knew she had the experience from that side. It's sort of, I wanted to have someone in the room who could speak to that, Who
had that experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so it was while concepting that event that I realized I needed some terminology to describe or explain who the conversation was for. And that was when I came up with the term sober curious. And there was quite a specific thought process that went into this. So my whole life, working as a journalist, a big part of my job was coming up with headlines and sort of ways to quickly sell an idea, cover lines for magazine stories, etc., etc. So I was quite used to sort of trying to boil down concepts into 2 or 3 word, kind of just easy to get, like this is it. And with Sober Curious, I started to think about what other areas of life do we allow for there to be some shades of grey? What other areas of life is it not such a binary, you're this or you're that, or it's this label or that label? And the first thing that came up was sexuality. And I thought about what feels now like quite an antiquated term, bi-curious. People used to use the term bi-curious to describe people who were experimenting with their sexuality but didn't want to necessarily put a label on it either way. And I thought, well, yeah, that's this approach. This is for people who are experimenting with removing alcohol from their life, but don't want it to have a label attached necessarily. And sober curious just seemed as well to speak to what I described already as just this curious approach of information gathering about
it's a
my
fluid
own
identity
It's
too.
very fluid. I've thought now, would it have been, if it had been 3 or 4 years later, this was in 2016, by the way, if it had been 3 or 4 years later, would it have been sober fluid?
Right. But I think you nailed it, because there's like a touch of risque to it, because people are like, oh, bi-curious, they have that connotation, and then they're like, oh, sober curious.
Exactly.
That sounds sexy, you know? It just
Exactly.
does. And I think that's one reason why it caught fire
I think so.
so quickly. I mean, you know, you've been credited with sparking this movement, and now, you know, I've heard you talk about how many people have heard this term now. I mean, how many people have heard this?
Well, I found some research at the beginning of this year which said that 1 in 4 Americans is now familiar with the term sober curious, you know, which is kind of mind-blowing.
It certainly
And we
is.
also, I say we, and I speak about myself and everybody who's part of this movement, but there was a segment on, or a scene in the new series of Emily in Paris, where she's suggesting to one of their clients that they do an alcohol-free version of their drink. And she talks all about the sober curious movement and what it is. And it sort of felt like, wow, from those kind of those early beginnings of 8 people in my apartment to, we then had 80 people, by the way, showed up at that first event, which to me was like, oh, a lot of people are
Where's
sober
happening
curious.
this?
A lot of
The one
people
in
are
Manhattan?
interested. Yes, and I think, did you guys sponsor that first
We
event?
did. We were there pouring Curious number 1. It was back when we only had one elixir, because we launched in 2015, and we've only had, you know, 1 per year. And yeah, we were there pouring Curious number 1, and I still remember the people I met there.
Right.
You know, like I remember the eye meditation that Biet had us do
Yes.
with the alternating eye meditation. It was a really powerful event, and I felt the sort of connection to people and other guests there that had been so lacking in the alcohol kind of fueled, you know, mixers or events that you go to. You know, you kind of go into these things and it's a little bit, if you don't know people, you're like, it's a little awkward, but almost nobody knew each other in these situations because it was so new. And that's what was freeing about it. I could sit down next to somebody and, you know, then you're interacting and doing an alternating eye meditation, and everybody's there for, you know, not exactly the same reason, but different reasons to come to the same conclusion, which is, I need to change my relationship with alcohol.
Or I
And-
need to question it.
To question it.
Even that being the starting place, you know. And I think, remember how I said that I have a need that is revealed in my birth chart, and which I completely relate to really speak the truth, to really talk about what's really going on here. I have a total aversion to sentimentality and bullshit and hypocrisy, and I can't stand skirting around a subject. We have to talk about the thing, or let's just not bother having a conversation, right? Small talk and me, like, just not going anywhere.
Let's get into it.
And
yeah.
so I think that actually we all have that need. We all get really excited when someone finally says, hey, let's talk about the thing that we're not allowed to talk about. And I think that's what I felt at those Club Soda events that Biet and I hosted over the next 2 years. We would do one every sort of 3-4 months or so. Was just a sense of kind of relief and excitement of like, oh, we can talk about this thing. We can actually unmask the elephant in the room and all just kind of without judgment have a conversation, you know, about how it is for us.
That's wonderful. I just got a visual of unmasking an elephant, which is so great. I want to unmask the elephant in the room
I can totally
every
picture
time.
that happening here.
Yeah, we've got some cheetahs and some leopards around. I think we need an elephant still.
An elephant. Unmasking the elephant in the room.
But,
yeah.
you know, and then, you know, from Club Soda, you end up publishing then, you know, Sober Curious, this book, you know, at the end of 2018. It starts taking off like wildfire. And all of a sudden, there's a lot of momentum going on behind this. Like, how did your life change when that started taking off?
So the book came out December 31st, 2018. And so I wrote it. It happened quite quickly. I wrote it in 6 months. I think after this, by the time we had done 2 or 3 Club Soda events, Sober Curious had already been named like a key wellness trend by like Well and Good and Mind Body Green and all these kind of online wellness platforms. So there was already kind of excitement building around the concept. After the book came out, keeping in mind my first book had come out a year and a half prior, so I'd already had a flavor of kind of how it feels to have a book come out, have an event, have some publicity. But the Sober Curious thing was on another level. Like, the publicity kind of didn't stop for about a year. So that year, 2019, was just constant podcasts, radio interviews,
TV shows,
interviews, etc., just kind of getting the word out there, which is amazing. And it's funny, like, I've since applied the Sober Curious sort of mindset to many other addictions or like kind of behaviors. Well, one of them, my addiction to validation. I have a huge addiction to external validation, as many of us can probably relate to as well. And it's one of the things that really drove me to achieve, you know, in my career, a lot of my ambitions as a journalist. And so on the one hand, having that much attention on me was very exciting and kind of like great, a real buzz. And at the same time, it was incredibly depleting because it was burning me out in a way to kind of have to be, or to be the figurehead for this thing, because I am a very kind of sensitive person, you know, and I'm much more of a behind the scenes person. My ideal week is like 2 or 3 things on my calendar where I have to interface with other human beings, and the rest of the time like reading and writing and thinking and long walks on my own. Like, I
feel that as I've gotten older, it's same for me. I used to be out 5 nights a week, and now it's like 2.
Right.
That's enough.
Yeah. That's mine aren't even nighttime things though. Mine are like afternoon coffees.
This is one of them.
This is one of them.
Awesome.
You got one of them this week.
Thank you.
But anyway, so it was an amazing year. And I think making it about the way that my validation monster sort of made it about me versus this being about a message that's really for the greater good sort of also burned me out, because it felt I had this constant performance anxiety when I was speaking about it and when I was kind of like doing events and hosting things. And what I really try to do now when I'm speaking about my books is just sort of, I don't know, just let it be more about the message and less about like me being in the spotlight, you know? Because yeah, I find it very tiring.
So while you were writing this book, Sober Curious, was there ever a moment that you doubted yourself?
No. Like I said, I was slightly nervous about presenting what could come across as an alternative to a program like AA. I didn't want to endanger anybody or put anybody at risk. And for Sober Curious to be a block for them getting a deeper level of treatment if they needed it. But what I always came back to was, my message is drink less alcohol. My message is question your drinking. And I didn't think that could ever do anyone any harm. And so I always came back to this baseline of like, I'm telling people to drink less. This is not going to harm anybody. Nobody is ever going to regret not drinking. Nobody is ever going to get harmed from choosing not to drink. And so I kept coming back to that baseline. And to that first point, what I've discovered and seen multiple times over the past 7-8 years is that for many people, getting sober curious is actually a necessary stepping stone to a recovery program that they might not have got to as quickly had they not had this kind of door open to them. Something I learned is that only 1 in 10 people who perceive alcohol as being a problem for them will actually actively seek help.
Wow. Which
means that for every 1 person you see in a rehab or an AA meeting, there are 9 other people who are questioning their drinking. So I see Sober Curious as serving those 9 people, right? That 90% of people who are questioning their drinking, but maybe it hasn't got quite bad enough that they feel they need to be in recovery. And I think the more doorways we can open to people getting support, or even deciding not to drink, right? I think that can never be a bad thing.
And the thing that I love most about your approach to life is the questioning. Mm-hmm. It's asking the questions. You're like, I may not have all the answers, but I have all the questions. Mm-hmm. The answers will reveal themselves. But if you don't ask the question, you're not going to go anywhere.
Right. And so even, it's now This was all happening sort of 5 years ago or so. And I'm still questioning my relationship with alcohol. The texture of those questions has dramatically changed because I feel zero attachment to alcohol now. I don't actually ever drink alcohol. It's been at least 2 years since I had a drink. And even in the years prior to that, it was maybe 1 or 2 a year. On those occasions, I wasn't even really finishing the drink. It was very much an experiment of like, how does it feel now? Like, how does it feel in this situation? And it typically just did not feel good.
I had that very recently when I tried mine.
And so based on that information, I made a decision a couple of years ago to be like, no, that's it for me. That's it for me. And I say I'm still questioning it because I'm questioning because you remove alcohol, especially when it's been a big central part of your life, and it does leave a gap. I'm still questioning what are the things that I can use to relax? What are the things that I can use to switch off my incredibly curious kind of questioning mind when I need to relax? What are the things that can make me enjoy my social actions and interactions and feel more easeful in my social interactions? So yeah, there's still questioning for me around like, what does that look like without alcohol, you know?
So many people have read this book and recommended it to others. Are there any standout moments or stories from people from reactions to this piece of work?
The stories that always stand out to me and the ones that like really touch my heart. And it's interesting as somebody who doesn't have children, but it's the parents who will tell me how much more present they're able to be with their kids, how much more they're able to enjoy their time with their children, how much they feel like they're modeling a much better relationship to alcohol to their kids. Like those are the stories that really touch me because, I mean, I've seen time and again the ripple effect when one person gets sober curious in a group, whether it's in a family, a friend group, a work group, you can be guaranteed that like the ripple effect is going to ripple out and a lot of their friends and family are going to start also questioning their drinking. And when that starts having a positive impact on parents' relationships with their children and those kids' relationships to how they perceive alcohol and the role of alcohol in the world, that I think is really, really inspiring.
Yeah, presence is everything. Mm-hmm. It really is presence and consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Absolutely. Especially, I mean, like I said, I don't have kids, but yeah, just becoming so much more aware of family dysfunction and how it perpetuates and what's needed to be a conscious parent. Like, yeah.
You're helping to heal wounds that won't even exist now.
Right. I'm helping to stop wounds happen.
Right. It's incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, I know my father struggled. He wasn't necessarily an alcoholic, but he was like borderline. Mm-hmm. And he cut drinking out, when I was like, when I was like 1 year old.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But he also that's when he left home.
Right.
And so it's like a complicated time. But I know that he was more present with me because he had cut alcohol out of his life. Then he was able to, later in life, he kind of came back to drinking some after a trip in Italy. And he was able to moderate. But I think that's pretty rare, But I bring up that story because there's so many different ways to engage with these different things, whether it's coffee or, or exercise. You can become addicted to anything. Mm-hmm. But alcohol is just one of the most addictive substances, and you have to be really careful with it. And I think that the way that you've inspired people to question helps provide new models for people to understand, you don't have to go through life this way or that way. You get to choose.
Exactly.
How do you want to be? Ask the question. You don't have to have the answers.
Exactly. And of all the things we can develop an addiction to, like work, email, social media, these are all things that I've grappled with myself, right? Alcohol also has some really nasty side effects, not just on a physical kind of physiological level. Alcohol is actually the third leading cause of preventable deaths in the United States, right? But also on an emotional level. When I think about the way that alcohol prevents us from really feeling what we're feeling and really connecting feelings, thoughts, actions, and behaviors, and the kind of knock-on effect of not being present to what we're feeling and therefore present to what we need, it's huge, So I do think alcohol has unique properties that can be particularly harmful as far as addictions go.
You talked about the gap in your life, when you take alcohol out. What have you filled it with? What else has brought you joy and fulfillment in those gaps?
I think just getting really discerning about who I'm spending my time with. So, I mean, really, it's about focusing all of my energy on the connections where I really feel I can be myself, where I really enjoy the exchange, you know, and focusing on quality over quantity in terms of my social interactions.
Absolutely.
But in terms of, I mean, I would love to find a way to switch my brain off in the way that alcohol used to switch my brain off. I just don't know if that exists outside of other kind of prescription medications. And
Right.
so, yeah, that's still something, that's still something I'm grappling with and will probably grapple with for the rest of my life. Though that said, like really being conscious of my calendar. What are the kind of things that I know are going to stress me out? If I have that on my calendar in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to be thinking about it constantly. Just minimizing to what extent that I can those sorts of situations that I know are going to cause that mental agitation for me, which is a huge privilege, first and foremost, to be able to have that much control over my schedule and my life. And also, yeah, I think really vital to my well-being.
And, you know, and I know that you had another book come out last year. What's that book all about?
So my new book is called Women Without Kids. The subhead is The Revolutionary Rise of an Unsung Sisterhood. I'm somebody who never wanted to have children, and throughout my life, to varying degrees, tried to make myself want to have children because it felt so odd and so unusual and so stigmatized, to the point that I felt there must be something seriously wrong with me to not want to have children. I reached a point where I wanted to look more deeply at why this is such a stigmatized path, the path of non-parenthood. Completely different subject, but for me the two projects are very linked. Choosing to be a non-drinker and choosing not to have children. In both those instances, you are willfully putting yourself in the out group in order to, and prioritizing your own needs and your own feelings and desires over what the kind of dominant culture is telling you to do. Putting yourself in the out group can be so alienating and lonely and disorienting. And yet it's often what we need to do in order to pursue the path that's right for us. So for me, these two books are very much about validating the desire to be different or to live an unconventional life, whatever that might look like, actually. And then hopefully providing people kind of like some tools, some support, some things to be curious about as you kind of embark on that path.
Yeah. Well, I think you are an incredible role model for so many people who are questioning who they want to be, how they want to be. I saw this quote of yours where like, who am I when I strip away all of the conditioning? And I think that's so important for people to think about. It's like, who are you underneath the surface? Yeah. What is the root spark inside of you that wants to turn into a fire?
Right.
You know?
Right.
And so thank you for being that person, because there aren't that many examples. As we were growing up, there weren't examples of people who were like, oh, I'm choosing not to drink, I'm choosing not to have kids.
Right.
And so you're like the first wave of this for so many people. So thank you for being that person, because I'm sure that there are thousands of people out there whose lives are different now because you gave them that framework. Before we wrap up the show, you know, we have a few curious questions that I'd like to ask. The first of which is, what is your first music memory?
My first music memory?
Yes.
Oh my God, I think it's my dad playing us Cliff Richard songs on his guitar.
Amazing. What Cliff Richard song are you hearing?
Living Doll.
Living Doll. Wow. Playing on his guitar. Amazing.
He didn't live with us, so we had weekends with Dad, and they were the fun times. And yeah, he played the guitar, acoustic guitar, and would sing us his favorite pop songs of the time.
I love that. That's great.
Yeah.
So the second curious question is, what is your first powerful food memory?
Ooh. Baking with my mom. My mom, when I was a young kid, was following a macrobiotic diet. She was really into kind of like alternative medicine and organic food and macrobiotics. And this is like the 80s, so it was quite weird. Like I would be the kid at school with like a dookie bean stew in a thermos flask when everyone else is eating like, you know, burgers and fries, whatever. But I remember baking with her. She used to make her own whole wheat bread, and we used to make little pastries and things. So
wonderful.
yeah.
I love that. So what was the treat that you were baking that is popping
Oh,
out?
we used to make jam tarts. I don't know if you have that was that an American thing? It's
Not
the
often, but
simplest
you see
thing.
them
It's just
sometimes.
like pastry with a dollop of jam in the middle, baked
Yum.
in the oven. Yeah.
Yum. It's like a Hamantaschen, but British style.
Right.
I love that. And is there anything else that we should cover today that you think that we didn't cover?
I suppose one thing that comes up sometimes is, is sober curious about mindful drinking. And to me, that's a bit of an oxymoron, because I think that one of the main reasons, and I touched on this already, that we use alcohol is to get out of our mind, right? Is to switch off our brain, to switch off the thinking brain. And as soon as we've had even a few sips of alcohol, we're not really in our quote unquote right mind, like our decision making capacities are limited. And so I think putting the words mindful and drinking together has never really sat well for me, although I understand that that term is also popular because, again, it's sort of kind of obvious what people mean when they say mindful drinking, in terms of it means drinking with more consciousness. But hey, drink enough and you'll be unconscious pretty quickly. So they're uneasy bedfellows for me. So for me, sober curious is not really about mindful drinking. It's about being in that space of curiosity. And if your questioning about alcohol shows you it's actually really hard for me not to drink in certain situations, being sober curious actually can be a valid way to quit drinking completely. I used to be wary of saying that because the messaging that the only way to quit completely is to do a 12-step program and to be in Alcoholics Anonymous. But actually, I think that being sober curious is valid for people who want to completely remove alcohol from their lives.
Absolutely. You heard it here from Ruby Warrington. I want to thank you so much for being on the Stay Curious show. And how should people find you online?
My website is rubywarrington.com and there's a contact form there. But I plan to be not so online in the next year or so. So
I think
people might have to come to one of my retreats and find me in person instead.
I think that's a great way of doing it. Be sure to find her retreats on rubywarrington.com. Thank you so much for being here, Ruby. You've done more than anyone that I know of in order to spark this movement and to keep it going into the forward. So very grateful for you for that.
Well, thanks for having me and for being there from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks everyone for watching today, and we'll see you soon. Stay curious, everybody.
Are you curious?